Good evening. Tonight, we follow the story of Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. So, cozy up in bed under the blankets and prepare for a wonderful night of sleep. Once you're all settled in, close your eyes. Long ago, two brothers by the names of Alibaba and Qasim lived in the land of Persia, in a city tucked away at the edge of the desert. The rich people there lived in mansions made of white stone, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens filled with rows of white jasmine flowers. The poor people lived on the outskirts of the city, in an area bordered by a pine forest. They lived in 1 or 2 room houses with tattered pieces of cloth covering the windows and roofs that leaked when it rained. Qasim and Alibaba lived modest lives there in the poor end of town. They spent most of their days in the forest chopping wood to sell in the marketplace. When their father passed away, the brothers only inherited 3 donkeys and a small bag of silver coins. Fortune was kinder to Qasim than to Alibaba. Qasim married the heiress of one of the richest families in the land. He went from wearing the tattered white robes of a farmer to the red silk robes of the wealthy. Alibaba married a woman just as poor as himself. As his brother dined with aristocrats and royalty, Alibaba continued to work long days in the forest. Every morning at sunrise, Alibaba would go into the forest with his wagon and 3 donkeys. One of the back wheels was broken on the cart and let out a shrill screech every time the wheel went around. When he arrived in the forest, he would chop towering pine trees in the hot sun until arriving home long after the sun went down. He would then pile the wood behind his house for his wife to bring to the marketplace. One day, when Alibaba was cutting wood in a clearing deep in the forest, he saw a group of imposing men riding on horseback. Each one of them were dressed in black robes, adorned with gold trims, and rode on horses black as night. By the dagger hanging from their hips, Alibaba knew they were the band of robbers that had been terrorizing the village. One of the horses let out a loud neigh, and Alibaba dropped to his knees before the robbers saw him. Then he scrambled up the trunk of a nearby pine tree with tightly packed branches and hid as the troop of robbers gathered below him. Alibaba counted 40 robbers in all. The men got off their horses and began walking toward a large boulder, the size of the largest house in the village. The boulder was at the base of a small mountain at the edge of the clearing. Each man carried a large bag of money, heavy with gold and silver coins. Then, a man who appeared to be the captain of the troop advanced closer to the boulder, while the rest of the men stood behind him. He was tall with broad shoulders and strong arms that were apparent even through his black robe, and a long beard that covered his throat. With his brows furrowed and a serious expression on his face, he cleared his throat and bellowed the words, "Open Sesame," toward the boulder. His voice echoed so loudly that birds scattered from the treetops with a loud whoosh. When the captain's voice stopped echoing, a secret door slid open from the rock. The band of robbers entered the hidden cave, and the rock snapped shut behind them. Alibaba waited for the men to come back out, not daring to breathe as he waited. He listened to the sound of the wind rustling through the treetops until all 40 men had exited the cave. The captain shouted again at the rock, "Close sesame!" The band of robbers climbed onto their horses again and galloped away through the forest. Alibaba took a few moments to catch his breath before climbing down the tree. He waited nearly an hour at the base of the tree to make sure the men weren't coming back, and when he was certain he was alone, he cleared his throat and yelled, "Open sesame!" toward the rock. The same door slid open and revealed the secret cave within. Alibaba crept into the dark and dismal cavern. A drop of cool water dripped from the rocky ceiling and hit his head. Light poked into the cave from a small opening over the door. Bales of hay were piled around the hideout, with sheets of silk on top. Scattered throughout the base were rolls of rich-looking red carpeting, money bags, and heaps of gold and silver nuggets. Alibaba didn't hesitate. He immediately began piling as much of the riches onto the cart as he could. Then he covered his newfound wealth with logs so he wouldn't be detected as he pulled it into town. When Alibaba got home, he uncovered the bags and carried them into his house. His wife's eyes popped as she gazed upon her husband's sudden wealth. "Alibaba," she said, "who have you been robbing to accumulate such wealth?" Alibaba rose a finger to his lips and made a shushing sound before explaining to his wife the story in vivid detail. His wife began to open the hefty bags of coins, but Alibaba stopped her. "There is no time to waste," he said. "We need to bury it quickly, in case the robbers come looking for it." His wife insisted that they had to know the totality of their newfound treasure. So she ran to the house of Alibaba's brother Kasim to borrow a scale before Alibaba could stop her. Kasim was not at home when she arrived, but she was greeted by his wife, who wore a golden dress that draped to the floor of their luxurious mansion. The house had 2 rows of palm trees leading to the entranceway. The green tops of the trees stood out from the sandy brown color of the desert, even in the dim light of the evening. The house itself was built from white brick, with mighty pillars supporting the awnings over the entranceway. Alibaba's wife asked her for a scale and told her it was for weighing the wood that Alibaba had chopped that day. Kasim's wife laughed as she pictured her husband's brother weighing log after log on the scale. She knew they couldn't afford a scale of their own, so she fetched the scale and gave it to her. Alibaba's wife returned to her paltry home and weighed mountain after mountain of gold and silver coins that shimmered under candlelight. The coins chinked together every time she poured a bag onto the table. Each time she finished counting one of the heaps, Alibaba took the pile to the backyard to bury. They continued the process until a faint glow appeared on the horizon. The next day, Alibaba didn't return to the forest as usual. He spent the day in bed, recovering from the night before. His wife carried the scale back to Kasim's estate in the afternoon. After she left, Kasim's wife peered at the scale and noticed a small gold nugget stuck to the bottom. She plucked the gold rock from the scale and twirled it around her hand. When Kasim came home, she showed the nugget to him. She explained that even though he thought he was rich, his brother was infinitely richer. He has so much money that he didn't count his money, but weighed it. Kasim spent the entire night thinking about his brother's secret wealth. Since he had married the heiress, he had a sense of pride knowing that he had done so much better for himself than his brother. Now, he was suddenly afflicted by an overwhelming fit of jealousy. The next day, he walked to Alibaba's home. As he expected, Alibaba was not in the woods, but laughing merrily with his wife. "Alibaba," Kasim said as he entered the home, "you act as if you are poor, but I know you are hiding a secret wealth." He held up the gold nugget that his wife had found. "Tell me, brother, where did this wealth come from?" Alibaba had no choice but to tell his brother about the band of thieves he had happened across. His brother threatened to turn him in to the thieves unless he told him where the treasure was hidden. So, Alibaba told his brother of the cave in the forest with the secret password, "Open Sesame." The next morning, as the sun was casting a reddish hue over the village, Kasim rode on horseback toward the cave to see it for himself. He followed the landmarks his brother had given him before stumbling across the clearing. He dismounted his muscular white steed and stood in front of the boulder with his hands on his hips. "Open Sesame!" Kasim exclaimed. The boulder in front of him shimmered and made a grinding sound as the secret door flung open. When Kasim entered the cave, he saw more riches than he thought was possible. He grabbed bag after bag of coins and laid them at the entranceway of the cave. He was so hypnotized by the infinite riches in front of him that he forgot the password to make the door open again. "Open barley!" he exclaimed, but the door remained shut. "Open wheat!" he said, but again the door remained fastened. "Open furrow!" but again nothing. He tried grain after grain until the robbers returned around noon. They spotted Kasim's steed tied to a tree and approached the rock. "Open Sesame!" exclaimed the captain. The rock slid open and Kasim rushed out. He tackled the captain, but the rest of the robbers constrained Kasim by the time the word sesame stopped echoing through the grove of trees. The robbers discussed among themselves what to do with Kasim. Eventually, they came to the decision to tie him to a raft and sail him into the Mediterranean. By the time the raft hit land, Kasim would be so far away that he would never find his way home again. When night fell and Kasim had still not returned, his wife grew uneasy. She ran to Alibaba's quaint home and begged him to search for his brother. Alibaba set out for the forest the next morning with his 3 donkeys, his cart, and his axe. He approached the clearing carefully in case the gang was still in the area. When he saw the scrapes in the dirt from a recent struggle, he assumed that fate had not been kind to his brother. When he returned to his brother's home, he was met at the door by his brother's maid, Morgiana. Morgiana was a young woman in her early 20s, with large eyes and black hair braided to nearly her waist. Alibaba's oldest son had expressed his interest in taking Morgiana's hand in marriage, but Alibaba forbade his son from marrying her. "Morgiana," said Alibaba, "I need you to tell the mistress that my brother has passed, but please, I beg you to keep it a secret." Morgiana returned with Kasim's wife, who was already wailing and dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Alibaba told her about the cave and what he suspected had happened to his brother. He explained to the women that it was important to pretend that Kasim had died a natural death, or it might raise questions around the town. Before returning home, Alibaba sent Morgiana to the local apothecary to ask for a potion meant to cure deadly diseases. She explained to the apothecary that her master was ill, but that the cause remained a mystery. The next day, she returned to the apothecary again and told him the bad news. With tears in her eyes, she explained that her master had died. Morgiana walked home through the marketplace, where merchants sold everything from fresh spices to sheets of colorful silk. She came across an old cobbler named Baba Mustafa, fixing a pair of well-worn leather boots. The cobbler must have been over 80 years old and stood with a prominent hunch in his back. Morgiana handed a nugget of gold to the man and explained to him that she had a secret project she needed help with. The cobbler stared mystified at the gold in his hand and nodded tentatively. She blindfolded the cobbler and handed him an even more impressive piece of gold. Holding the man's hand, she led him to Kasim's home. The cobbler pieced together a scarecrow from old pieces of clothes and straw from the barn behind the house. Morgiana dressed the scarecrow in Kasim's finest robes. The dummy looked so lifelike that if anybody saw the body, they would think that it was Kasim, as long as they kept the face covered. The last thing they needed was a rumor circulating the town that he had died stealing gold from a band of thieves. After the funeral, Alibaba moved into his brother's home. His brother's wife and her maid Morgiana continued to live in the house with him and his wife. For the first time in his life, Alibaba was able to live a life of luxury. But the fear of the thieves coming back for their treasure persisted. So he hid his newfound wealth from the villagers. If anybody asked him how he went from wearing tattered rags to robes of silk, he told them that his brother had given him his fortune when he passed. Meanwhile, back in the forests, the band of robbers realized they had been discovered. In their secret cave, they discussed what they should do to keep from losing the entirety of the fortune, and how to get back what was stolen from them. The captain decided to send one of his most loyal men into the town, disguised as a shepherd. The man wore loose-fitting brown robes with a red keffiyeh head covering. He left the camp that night with his hooked cane and arrived in town at sunrise. Once he arrived, the man opened his ears to the rumbling of the town, listening for any news of a man who recently disappeared. His wandering brought him to the stall of the cobbler Baba Mustafa in the marketplace. The old man was hard at work with an awl in his hand, even though the sun was only just starting to poke over the roofs of the stone buildings around the market. The disguised thief asked Baba Mustafa how he was able to work in such dim light. The cobbler's eyes lit up as he explained that he had the eyes of a much younger man. In fact, his eyes were so good that he was entrusted for a special project. The thief asked the cobbler what type of secret project he could have possibly been involved in. Baba Mustafa leaned toward the man and described how he had been hired to sew a scarecrow together to look like a wealthy man in town who had disappeared. The robber smiled to himself and couldn't believe his good luck. He placed a gold coin into the cobbler's hand and asked him to lead him to the house. The cobbler spun the coin between his fingers and explained to the man that he could not take him to the house. A woman had led him blindfolded. The robber dropped another gold coin into the cobbler's hand and brandished a handkerchief. Baba Mustafa clenched the gold coin and told the robber that he would try his best, but he couldn't guarantee that he could remember the way. The cobbler tied the handkerchief around his eyes, and the two men headed off in the same direction that Morgiana had led the cobbler the day before. After walking for about half an hour, the cobbler suddenly stopped and pulled the blindfold from his eyes. He declared that they had reached the home, and the robber eyed the gaudy mansion with palm trees growing in 2 rows along the entranceway. He made a note of the building by drawing a white chalk line on the door and dropped another piece of gold into the cobbler's hand. He returned to the forest to tell his band about the discovery. Later that day, Morgiana left the house to do some shopping in the market. She saw the chalk line on the door and pondered over its meaning. It had to mean that somebody intended to harm her master. So, she made the same mark on all the other houses on the street on her way to the marketplace. When the robber explained his findings to his gang, The men rejoiced and formulated a plan. "Comrades," said the captain, "we have no time to lose. Let us set off in groups of 2 so as not to raise suspicion, and rendezvous at the main square this evening." As the other men poured into town in pairs, the captain and the man who was dressed as a shepherd headed to Alibaba's house. They came to the first house that Morgiana had marked with chalk on her way to the marketplace. They quickly noticed that 5 or 6 of the houses all had the same mark. The spy could not remember which house had been the one the cobbler had led him to, so the plan had to be aborted. Under the cover of night, the thieves headed back to their lair as the hooves of their 40 horses caused the forest floor to rumble. The next day, the captain sent a more trustworthy spy into town. The spy bribed the cobbler and this time marked the house with an X in red chalk. Satisfied that the mark would not be imitated, he went back to the cave and told his comrades about his success. Shortly after the man had returned to the cave, Morgiana noticed the mark and once again replicated the mark on all the other houses on the street. When the robbers returned that evening, they became outraged to see that they had once again been foiled. Once again, they were forced to retire back to their hideaway. The next day, the captain decided to take the mission on himself. He dressed like a wanderlust traveler and once again bribed the cobbler. When he arrived at the house, he did not mark it with chalk, but memorized every detail of the home, so he could not possibly forget it. The house had 3 floors, each floor narrower than the last, so that they looked like a stack of stairs. Each floor had 3 windows with red silk curtains. Unlike many of the houses in the area, it didn't have jasmine in the garden, but pink roses that must have been imported from a faraway land. The house also had a stable and a central courtyard hidden behind a stone wall, and the captain could hear the clucking of chickens within. That evening, the band of robbers prepared for their revenge. Before heading to Alibaba's home, they bought 39 large clay jars from the marketplace. Each jar was about half a man tall and half a man wide at the top. They bought 1 jar filled with oil, and the rest of the jars were empty. They loaded the jars on the back of a cart pulled by 4 horses, and one of the robbers hid in each of the oil jars. The captain rode toward Alibaba's home, with his cart filled with the jars concealing his band of thieves. The streets were quiet, besides the sound of his horse's hooves against the tightly packed dirt. He continued to travel until he reached Alibaba's mansion. The captain knocked on Alibaba's door. "Greetings, sir," said the captain. "We are on our way to the marketplace to sell our oil, but are weary. Would you be so kind as to let us spend the night in your humble home?" Alibaba welcomed the man into his house and called one of his servants to help the man with his horses and to carry the jars to the yard. He called out to Morgiana to cook a great feast for the tired traveler. While Alibaba was giving Morgiana instructions about what to make for supper, the leader of the robbers snuck away to give his men orders. He went jar to jar and whispered to each man, "As soon as I throw some stones out of my chamber window, cut yourself free with your knife and join me in revenge." As Morgiana was preparing dinner, the light of her lantern went out, and she realized it was out of oil. Remembering the oil jars the traveler brought, she went to the yard to take just enough to refill her lantern. Surely the merchant wouldn't mind. After all, they were letting him stay the night free of charge. She cracked the lid of the first oil jar and heard a man ask in a low voice, "Is it time?" Morgiana snapped the lid shut and disguised her voice like the captain's. "Not yet, but soon." She may have been only a humble maid, but she knew that these men must be after the treasure. She took a deep breath and calmed herself. She had to pretend nothing was out of the ordinary, or else the men would know she was onto them. Morgiana went jar to jar, repeating the same words until she eventually reached the oil jar. When she returned to the house, Alibaba was sitting with the captain in the living room, still oblivious that he had let 40 thieves into his home. Instead of alerting Alibaba, which would have certainly meant both their demise, she went to her room and grabbed an old bedsheet and a decorative goblin mask. She went back to the yard and made a great blaze of flames in the fireplace. She lit a torch from the flames and cracked the lid on the first pot. With the mask pulled over her face, she whispered into the pot that she was a demon who would eat the man's soul unless he ran far, far away from here and stopped robbing people. The thief let out a whimper before jumping out of the pot and running toward the forest. She went to each pot until all 39 men had run away. Later that evening, Morgiana heard the captain at the window of his chamber. The captain threw a stone out the window toward the pots, but not a single man stirred. He threw at least a dozen stones before Morgiana heard him leave his bedroom. She looked out the window and saw the man in the yard checking the oil pots. When the captain discovered that all his men were gone, he climbed over the wall and retreated to his hideaway. The next morning, Morgiana explained to Alibaba what had occurred. Alibaba stood motionless with a mortified expression on his face. Finally, he asked, "And what became of the oil merchant?" Morgiana gave her account of seeing the man jump over the wall of the yard and escape. "I cannot thank you enough," said Alibaba. "You deserve to be rewarded accordingly, for I owe my life to you. From this moment onward, you are not my maid. Instead, you will be my personal assistant." Alibaba went to the market 20 times over the next month to sell the men's horses one by one, so not to raise any suspicion. Meanwhile, the captain lived in his gloomy cave without the companionship of his 39 men. He lamented about the loss of his gang as he plotted his revenge on Alibaba. When he had developed a plan, he went back into town dressed like a merchant and brought with him some of his carpets. He took lodging in an inn. As he expected, there was a rumbling among people in the town that something had happened at Alibaba's estate. Alibaba had gone from poverty to riches in less than a month, and he seemed even wealthier than his brother had. The captain bought a small shop across the road from the home of Alibaba's oldest son. After 3 days, he brought a carpet to Alibaba's son as a gift. The carpet was one of the most beautiful in his collection. It was hand-stitched into a series of crimson diamonds on a turmeric yellow background. The two men quickly developed a friendship. When Alibaba learned of his son's friendship with the new merchant, he told his son that he wanted to make the salesman's acquaintance. Alibaba's son led the captain to his father's house, not knowing that the captain had a dagger hidden beneath his robes. The captain was so well disguised that when he looked Alibaba in the eye and shook his hand, Alibaba couldn't recognize him. "Please, sir," said Alibaba, "I beg you to do me the honor of having supper with me and my son." The captain stroked his beard. "It would be my pleasure, sir." "Then I'll have my cook prepare you the finest meal." Alibaba went into his kitchen and told Morgiana to prepare a feast. When Morgiana was done cooking, she brought the food into the dining room where the men were conversing. She studied the merchant's face. It took her only a moment to recognize him through his disguise as the captain of the robbers. Morgiana contemplated how she was going to prevent the captain from exacting his revenge on Alibaba. Morgiana dressed herself in a golden dress with the goblin mask hidden at her hip. She re-entered the kitchen with one of the cooks, who carried a tiny drum and who pattered a steady beat as she danced. The captain began to worry that he would not be able to carry out his plan as he had hoped. He hid his dissatisfaction and clapped along to the music of the drum, keeping Alibaba in the corner of his eye. Morgiana was an excellent dancer and could outdance even most of the professionals in town with her quick, lithe movements. After she finished several songs, she pulled the mask from her hip and held it over her face. She leaned toward the captain and whispered, "I know what kind of life you've lived. Run far, far away, or I will steal your soul for all eternity." The captain was so afraid of the ghastly image of the mask that he stood up and knocked his seat to the floor. He ran out of the home and toward the forest. He kept running until the town and Alibaba were a distant memory. "What have you done to my guest?" exclaimed Alibaba as he rose from his seat. "I once again saved you. This man was the fictitious oil merchant and the captain of the gang." "Morgiana," said Alibaba, "I have already given you your freedom, but for saving my life again, I promise I'll give you your share of the fortune. I can never repay you." And so, Alibaba was true to his word. He gave Morgiana a portion of his wealth, and shortly after, his son asked for her hand in marriage. Their wedding was one of the largest to ever be held in the town. Table after table was filled with delicious treats, and some of the best dancers in the land came to perform. At the year's end, Alibaba returned to the cave with his son. He saw no signs of the cave being occupied since the gang of thieves were disbanded. Together, the men gathered the rest of the treasure and loaded it on a cart pulled by two mighty horses. Neither Alibaba or his son's family were ever bothered by the robbers again. On this note, our story ends. Good night and sweet dreams.